The deadliest new American weapon at the Battle of the Bulge wasn't a tank, a plane, or a secret gun. It was an invisible fuse. In December 1944, German infantry in the frozen Ardennes formed up for attack, confident Allied artillery couldn't see them through the snow. Then the shells began exploding above their heads, shredding whole companies before a single shot was fired back. Soldiers swore the Americans had radar in their shells. How did a fuse no bigger than a fist turn the tide of Hitler's last offensive? Winter 1944. The Ardennes forest lay under snow and low cloud, its roads frozen into narrow corridors between pine and ridge. Allied commanders believed the front quiet, a place where worn-out divisions could recover. Instead, on December 16th, Hitler unleashed his last gamble. A massive surprise offensive meant to split the Western Allies and seize Antwerp. It was the Battle of the Bulge, and at first it went exactly as the Germans hoped. Fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft. Panzers rolled across thinly held lines, their spearheads punching deep into Belgium. American troops were caught off guard, cut off, and retreating. German infantry, moving in mass under the cover of weather, swarmed crossroads and villages. With skies closed to fighter bombers, the old rules returned. Artillery had to guess, defenders had to hold, and attackers could mass without fear of air attack. For the first days, the German timetable worked. Convoys rolled through the woods, artillery batteries deployed in open fields, and troops assembled in thick columns before striking. American observers radioed for fire, but knew their shells would burst on impact or with crude time fuses. Deadly, but often too late to break up an attack before it hit their lines. At Bastogne and Saint-Vith, thin rings of defenders stared across white fields at wave after wave of men and armor forming under cover of haze. Yet, hidden inside Allied supply dumps was a weapon that had never before been unleashed on land. For 2 years, US Navy scientists and British engineers had been developing a miniature radar transmitter, small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. Known as the VT, or Variable Time Fuse, it had already proven its worth at sea, detonating anti-aircraft shells just as enemy planes reached their most vulnerable point. The fuse could sense its target and explode at the optimum height, a kind of invisible trigger, turning every gun into a precision weapon. Until December 1944, the War Department had kept the VT fuse strictly off the battlefield, fearing it might fall into enemy hands. Only a handful of ordnance officers knew it was coming to Europe at all. But as the Bulge offensive unfolded, secrecy bowed to necessity. Under emergency orders, proximity-fused shells were rushed to the Ardennes, distributed quietly to artillery units under cover of darkness. Crews received whispered instructions, warned never to let an intact shell fall into enemy hands. To the German commanders massing their men in snowy fields, nothing seemed different. American guns looked the same, their fire sounded the same, their muzzles flashed the same. But deep in the shell casings, a silent revolution waited. A tiny transmitter, a circuit of glass and vacuum tubes, and a battery ready to arm in flight. When the first waves advanced under the frozen canopy, the fuses would wake, sense, and strike from above. The idea that a tiny radar could survive the brutal launch of an artillery gun seemed like fantasy in 1940. Yet, in a cluster of laboratories scattered across the US and Britain, scientists were attempting exactly that. They called it the Variable Time Fuse, the VT. But to those on the inside, it was simply the most important ordnance experiment of the war. Each prototype was a miniature radio set, its antenna coiled in the nose, its vacuum tubes shrunken to withstand tens of thousands of Gs. The concept, sense a target as it approached, then detonate at the ideal moment. At first, the program was a gamble bordering on impossible. Navy Ordnance had funded it for anti-aircraft guns at sea, hoping to counter the kamikaze-style dives of enemy planes. The Army, however, doubted the fuse could ever work for field artillery. The shock of a 105mm howitzer launch, or a 90mm gun, was orders of magnitude higher than a naval gun's. Engineers from Johns Hopkins's Applied Physics Lab spent nights reinforcing glass tubes, devising self-arming batteries, and running tests at secret ranges. Failures were frequent. Shells dudded or exploded prematurely, wiping out months of work. But in the summer of 1943, the first real successes arrived. Fired from naval guns, proximity-fused shells shredded drone targets with uncanny precision. Navy gunners in the Pacific credited the fuse with saving ships from mass air attack at places like Leyte Gulf. In Washington, Army officers took note. If this fuse could be adapted for howitzers, it might transform land warfare, just as it had naval defense. By 1944, the prototypes had matured. Tiny ruggedized tubes, crush-proof batteries, and self-arming circuits meant the fuse could be fired from a howitzer, survive the launch, and still function. A few test shots at Aberdeen Proving Ground showed shells bursting at exact heights over impact targets, showering fragments in lethal cones. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a new class of weapon. Still, secrecy reigned. The War Department classified the VT fuse higher than the Manhattan Project. Soldiers who handled the new shells were told only the bare minimum. If one landed intact on enemy soil, scientists feared Germany could copy it within months. Even its transport to Europe was done under cover of routine shipments, with ordnance officers traveling as clerks to keep eyes off the crates. Behind the quiet arrival lay an enormous gamble. On paper, the fuse promised to end the massing tactics Germany relied on. In reality, it had never been tried under combat conditions on land. Snow, mud, freezing temperatures, all could ruin the delicate electronics. But with the Bulge offensive threatening to break the Allied line, the risk no longer seemed optional. If the VT fuse worked, American artillery could hit harder, faster, and with more precision than anything the Wehrmacht had faced before. If it failed, the secret would be lost, and the front could collapse. To a casual observer, the new American shells looked identical to any 105mm or 155mm round. Only the nose, slightly longer, and capped with a slender ogive, hinted at the revolution inside. In that nose sat a miniature radar set, a self-arming battery, and a circuit tuned to detect its target within a few meters. Unlike time fuses that had to be cut by hand, or impact fuses that went off only after striking the ground, the VT fuse created its own window of destruction. It sensed and reacted faster than any human gunner could. Each shell carried 4 crucial elements. First, a tiny vacuum tube transmitter pulsing a radio signal forward. Second, a receiving antenna coiled just under the skin. Third, a tuned circuit measuring the reflection of its own pulse. The moment a target entered its envelope, the return spike triggered detonation. And fourth, a ruggedized battery that armed itself after the shell's violent launch, guaranteeing the fuse stayed inert until it was safely downrange. Together, these pieces turned a standard howitzer round into a lethal airburst device. The advantages were immediate and measurable. Proximity fuses eliminated the guesswork of timed bursts. Gunners no longer had to estimate altitude or cut fuses for different ranges. Shells detonated automatically at the optimum point above the ground, producing a cone of shrapnel that doubled or tripled the lethal radius. Against troops in open terrain or lightly protected positions, the effect was catastrophic. Instead of plunging into the soil, burying much of their energy, rounds now burst overhead, showering fragments downward like a scythe. Even in bad weather, the fuse worked. Snow, fog, darkness, the very conditions that had grounded Allied air cover, became the perfect environment for VT shells. Radar pulses ignored the lack of visibility and reacted only to solid mass. The circuit didn't care if the battlefield was white, green, or muddy brown. This gave Allied artillery a kind of built-in all-weather precision that no one else possessed. Another hidden advantage was psychological. Because the shells burst above their targets, soldiers under fire saw explosions in the sky, rather than at impact. That inversion, destruction descending instead of erupting outward, felt unnatural and unstoppable. Troops accustomed to hugging the ground discovered fragments falling vertically into trenches, foxholes, and behind cover. Logistically too, the VT fuse was simple to use. Gunners loaded it as they would any standard shell. No hand-cutting fuses, No last-second adjustments under fire. This sped up rates of fire, letting batteries saturate targets more quickly. Commanders could mass fires without massing guns, preserving mobility and secrecy. In a battle defined by low clouds and frozen roads, the proximity fuse gave the US Army something priceless: a force multiplier hidden in plain sight. It was as if each gun crew had been granted invisible spotters floating above the battlefield, correcting their aim in real time and detonating rounds with unerring timing. For German planners, still confident in massed attacks and tree-line cover, it was a blind spot waiting to be punished. On December 23, 1944, the secrecy ended. In the snowbound Ardennes, American artillery batteries under siege around Bastogne were issued their first pallets of VT shells with whispered orders. Load and fire as normal, but record everything you see. The fuse's debut would not be marked by a ceremony, but by a curtain of steel and fragments above advancing German troops. That morning, German infantry from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division massed on a frozen tree line to assault an American roadblock. Under the old rules, the defenders could expect impact bursts, deadly but localized. This time, the first round screamed overhead and detonated in mid-air, raining shrapnel downward like a steel blizzard. Survivors later told interrogators it was as if invisible bombers had struck. Batteries at Elsenborn Ridge reported the same. Firing data unchanged, but shells now exploded 20 or 30 feet above ground, showering entire platoons. Officers scanning through binoculars saw formations shatter before reaching their start lines. Men dropped rifles and dove into snow as fragments tore through foxholes and shallow cover. What had once been a slow push across open ground became an instant rout. Word of the new shells spread across the front. Radio intercepts picked up panicked German chatter about radar shells and devil rounds. Officers complained to headquarters that artillery now hit them in places no bunker seemed safe. Within days, Allied guns were coordinating VT barrages to coincide with counterattacks, softening up assembly areas and killing momentum before the enemy even moved. For American crews, the effect was electric. Suddenly, their guns weren't just area weapons, but precision tools. Battery commanders spoke of walking barrages with surgical timing, cutting German columns to ribbons without risking their own troops. Infantrymen at Bastogne, pinned down and outnumbered, watched German attacks dissolve under airbursts and credited the new fuse with saving their lives. The Germans, used to timing their moves between artillery volleys, found the pattern inverted. No matter how carefully they waited or how quickly they ran, the shells burst above them, slicing into ranks once thought safe behind snow berms or tree trunks. Even tanks felt the sting as fragments disabled tracks, optics, and exposed crews. Within a week of the first firing, the proximity fuse had gone from secret experiment to battlefield legend. The Battle of the Bulge, once planned as a rapid German breakout, became a grinding retreat punctuated by sudden massacres from unseen fuses. And every day the weapon stayed secret was another day American gunners could rain destruction without giving the enemy time to adapt. By New Year's 1945, the proximity fuse had shifted from a secret edge to a full-scale doctrine. American artillery commanders, once cautious about revealing the weapon, began coordinating entire fire plans around its unique power. Instead of the traditional impact or timed bursts, batteries now built layered airburst zones over likely German approach routes. With every salvo, the math of warfare changed. One battery could do the work of several, blanketing wider areas and destroying troops still forming up. On the German side, the effect was visible in the pattern of attacks. After the first week of VT fire, Volksgrenadier battalions stopped massing in open fields. Assault groups were broken into small packets. Officers moved at night or under tree cover. But even these adjustments failed. The fuses ignored darkness and fog, bursting precisely above scattered men, just as easily as above a column. The Wehrmacht's tactical handbook, concentration of fire, shock by mass, had been turned against itself. Allied units at Bastogne and along the Elsenborn Ridge began timing counterattacks to coincide with VT barrages. Artillery would detonate above advancing Germans, then infantry would surge out of foxholes and sweep stunned survivors before they could reorganize. What had been a desperate holding action became a series of sharp, punishing counterstrikes. In debriefings later, American officers credited the fuses with reducing their own casualty rates and halting the German momentum at key points of the Bulge. The psychological shift extended to command levels. Eisenhower and Bradley, briefed on the secret fuse, authorized its widespread use despite the risk of capture. Every hour it remained undiscovered was an hour of asymmetric advantage. By mid-January, over 200,000 VT shells had been fired, rewriting the playbook of field artillery in real time. Even tank crews felt the impact. Airbursts disabled open-topped vehicles, shredded infantry riding on armor, and forced panzer grenadiers to dismount far from objectives. German artillery observers wrote of entire companies erased from snow before making contact. Luftwaffe records show fewer and fewer night resupply flights into forward areas, fearing Allied guns could range them even in darkness. Inside American gun pits, the effect was equally profound. Crews who had grown used to endless adjusting of time fuses now loaded shells without modification, letting electronics do the work. Rates of fire doubled, accuracy soared, and confidence grew that their unseen technology was outclassing anything Germany could field. By January, the US Army had effectively rewritten the doctrine of how to fight a defensive battle in winter. Use VT shells to strip mass from the enemy before he can strike, then counterpunch with infantry and armor. The Battle of the Bulge, conceived by Hitler as a blitz to split the Allies, was slowly being bled white under a canopy of airburst shrapnel. Proximity fuses had turned artillery from blunt hammer into precision scythe, cutting at the very tactic, mass shock, that Germany relied on to regain initiative. By mid-January 1945, the proximity fuse was no longer just a technical edge. It had become a force inside German soldiers' minds. In foxholes and dugouts along the Ardennes front, survivors whispered about magic shells that could see through snow and darkness. They had grown up with predictable artillery. Shells hit the ground or burst at pre-cut intervals. Now rounds detonated above their heads, raining steel in every direction, punishing anyone who dared to group up. Prisoner interrogations captured the shift in tone. Captured Volksgrenadiers spoke of watching entire platoons vanish under invisible barrages. Others described running for tree cover only to be shredded as branches exploded over them. It felt like the sky was wired to our footsteps, one sergeant told his American captors. German field police recorded more instances of men going to ground or refusing to advance once VT fire began. Even seasoned officers lost confidence. Their tried and true countermeasures, camouflage, dispersal, darkness, no longer guaranteed safety. Field orders began to sound defensive, urging troops to avoid concentration and move singly rather than mass for attack. The very essence of blitzkrieg, shock by numbers, had been hollowed out. Commanders at corps level worried they could not sustain momentum if every assembly area became a death trap. For the Americans, morale flipped in the opposite direction. Infantrymen who had felt abandoned under grey skies now saw artillery doing the work of aircraft. They spoke of shells bursting like invisible bombers overhead, a comfort and a promise that someone had their back. Gun crews wrote home about making the snow walk, their slang for airburst shrapnel that cut trails across enemy ranks. The psychological pressure extended beyond the front line. German supply convoys altered schedules or cancelled runs, fearing pre-registered fire zones. Wounded troops filled aid stations with injuries, unlike traditional artillery wounds. Fragment patterns descending from above, rather than outward from craters. This difference reinforced the sense of an unstoppable new weapon, a weapon that ignored the rules of cover and concealment learned over 5 years of war. Reports from American intelligence noted a sharp uptick in intercepted German chatter questioning their own high command. Troops speculated that the Allies had perfected radar shells or were guided by unseen aircraft. Some believed each gun had its own spotter drone, decades before drones existed. the more exaggerated the rumors became, the stronger the proximity fuse's grip on German morale. By the time weather cleared and Allied aircraft returned to the skies, the damage was already done. German troops no longer trusted their own doctrine or timing. They had watched entire formations erased not by tanks or airstrikes, but by something hidden inside ordinary shells. The proximity fuse had achieved a rare feat, turning artillery into a psychological weapon as powerful as its physical destruction. By February 1945, the secret was out. Not because Germany had captured a fuse, but because the scale of destruction made it obvious something new was in play. Proximity-fused shells had shredded entire Volksgrenadier battalions, halted armoured thrusts, and carved open the offensive Hitler had gambled everything on. What began as a desperate experiment at Aberdeen and Johns Hopkins had changed the face of field artillery overnight. Post-battle analyses told the story in numbers. More than 1 million proximity-fused shells were fired in the European theatre before WWII Day. In the Ardennes alone, American batteries credited the VT fuse with doubling or tripling effectiveness compared to time-cut rounds. Infantry commanders wrote in after-action reports that entire attacks ceased to exist under airbursts. When Eisenhower briefed the fuse's performance to the combined chiefs of staff, he ranked it alongside radar and the atomic bomb as a war-winning technology. Beyond the battlefield, the VT fuse rewrote doctrine. Its success proved that electronics could survive gun launch and opened the door for guided munitions, smart fuses, and precision strike concepts that would define the Cold War. After 1945, proximity fuses became standard in anti-aircraft guns, naval shells, and later missiles. Today, every airburst or smart artillery system traces its ancestry to the secret boxes unloaded in the Ardennes that winter. German veterans remembered the difference viscerally. Years later, in oral histories, soldiers described the sky coming apart above them, fragments falling in curtains instead of arcs. American veterans remembered it as the moment artillery truly protected them, even when air power was grounded. This shared memory, fear on one side, relief on the other, underscored just how radical the fuse had been. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge did not break the Allied line. Proximity fuses helped ensure it. By stripping mass from German attacks, they blunted Hitler's last offensive and accelerated the march to the Rhine. A weapon smaller than a man's fist had helped decide the largest land battle fought by the US Army in World War II. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, American gunners unleashed a silent fuse that detonated above the enemy and beneath history, ending the last gamble of the Reich. If you want more hidden weapon stories from World War II, hit subscribe and tell us which secret project or battlefield legend you'd like us to uncover next.